We live a simple but satisfying life in Piney Grove. Come to see us when you can.
A slow, steady autumn drizzle is drumming against the front windows of Jack's Diner, casting a gray, sleepy light over Piney Grove. Inside, the diner is a beacon of warmth. Jack walks over to the corner booth carrying his latest creation, a massive, deep dish platter of what he calls the barnyard. It's a mountain of crispy hash browns, covered in scrambled eggs, smothered in thick sausage gravy, and topped with a generous, melting scoop of homemade jalapeno pimento cheese. The Cotton Patch Study Bibles are open, and the men are digging in for 1 Samuel chapter 27. Larry, cutting a forkful of hash browns and pimento cheese. Jack, this might be the greatest thing you've ever invented. I don't know whether to eat it or frame it. All right, boys. We've had a couple of high-flying chapters where David acted with incredible faith and spared Saul's life. But as we cross into chapter 27, the adrenaline wears off, the weather turns gray, and David hits a wall. Jim R. Taking a sip of his black coffee, he hits it hard. You read verse 1, and it is one of the most honest, depressing verses in the whole biography of David. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. Dan, where's the faith in that? This is the guy who just told Saul, the Lord will deliver you into my hands. This is the guy who took down Goliath. And now he's talking to himself in the dark, convinced he's going to die. Pastor Cone, setting his mug down gently, it's called spiritual fatigue, Dan, and it is a very real, very dangerous thing. You can only run for your life, sleep in caves, and watch your back for so long before your flesh gets bone tired. Notice what the text says. David thought to himself. He didn't consult the Lord. He didn't ask the priest for the ephod as he did back in Keilah. He had a conversation with his own fears, and fear always tells you that God has abandoned you. Claude, stirring his coffee, that's exactly it, Pastor. When you stop listening to God's promises and start listening to your own exhaustion, you will almost always make a terrible decision. And look at his solution in verse 2. He takes his 600 men and their families, and he goes straight to Achish, the king of Gath. He goes back to the Philistines. Harold, laughing in disbelief, the hometown of Goliath. The last time David was in Gath, he had to pretend to be a drooling lunatic scratching at the gates to get out alive. Now he's marching back in there with a private army and asking for a job. Floyd, and surprisingly, Achish welcomes him with open arms. Why? Because politics make for strange bedfellows. Achish looks out the window, sees 600 battle-hardened Israelites who are actively at war with King Saul, and says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He figures David is a mercenary he can use against Israel. Henry, and the craziest part is, David's terrible, fleshly plan actually works. Look at verse 4. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Jim H., pointing his fork at Henry. Now that is the ultimate trap of the devil right there. Pragmatism. David stepped completely out of the will of God. He abandoned the promised land. He went to the enemy, and he finally got a good night's sleep. Sometimes, stepping into sin will give you immediate, temporary relief from your trials. Saul stopped hunting him, but that relief comes with a massive, soul-crushing price tag. Robert, because now he owes the devil rent. He's living in enemy territory. David is smart enough to know he can't stay in the royal city of Gath right under the king's nose. So in verse 5, he asks Achish for a country town. Achish gives him Ziklag. Dan, He wants to be out in the country so the boss can't see what he's actually doing. And verse 7 says David lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months, 16 months of living a complete double life. Larry, and that double life is brutal. Look at verses 8 and 9. David and his men go out and raid the Jeshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Now, these are the ancient, wicked enemies of Israel that God had ordered to be destroyed years ago. David is actually doing the Lord's work out there. But verse 9 says, whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. Harold, he slaughtered everybody. Why? Verse 11 tells us exactly why. David did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. He is executing every single person in those camps, just so there are no witnesses to go back and tell King Achish what he is really up to. Claude, it is a dark, desperate existence. He comes back to town with all this loot, and Achish asks him in verse 10, where did you go raiding today? And David lies straight to his face. He tells the Philistine king, oh, I was raiding the Negev of Judah. He tells Achish he was attacking his own people, the Israelites. Floyd, he's playing a terrifying game of chess. He's fighting Israel's enemies in the desert, but he's telling the Philistine king that he's killing Israelites, just to keep his cover story intact. And Achish buys it hook, line, and sinker. Verse 12, Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life. Jim R., setting his fork down and leaning back heavily. Boys, what a tragic place for the anointed king of Israel to be. Living in a pagan city, acting as a vassal to a Philistine king, slaughtering whole camps of people to cover his tracks, and lying through his teeth every time he comes home from work. Pastor Cohn, it is the inevitable result of compromise, Jim. When you get tired of fighting the Lord's battles, and you seek asylum in the world will demand your loyalty. David didn't have to dodge Saul's spears anymore, but he had to sell a piece of his soul to keep the peace. He is trapped in a web of his own deception, and as we'll see in the next few chapters, that web is about to catch up to him in the worst possible way. Dan, wiping his mouth with a napkin, staring at his empty plate, man, it really shows you that faith ain't a one-time decision. You have to wake up and choose it every single day, especially on the days you feel like giving up. Jim H., standing up and grabbing his worn leather jacket. You got that right, Dan. I reckon I need to stop having conversations with my own fears and start taking them to the Lord. Robert, tossing a stack of bills on the table. Amen. Let's get out there. Boys, no hiding in Gath today. We stay in the fight. The table shares a solemn but deeply encouraged nod. They pack up their Bibles, give Jack a wave of thanks for the incredible breakfast, and step out the glass door. The diner bell jingles as the Cotton Patch Study heads out into the cold, gray Piney Grove morning, carrying the heavy warning against spiritual compromise straight into their own daily battles. The heavy, gray clouds from last week have stubbornly settled over Piney Grove, casting a dim, gloomy light that makes the neon sign in the window of Jack's diner buzz a little louder. Inside, Jack walks over to the corner booth carrying exactly what a dark morning requires. A massive platter of crispy, golden country fried steak, completely smothered in thick, peppered white gravy, flanked by over-easy eggs and a mountain of buttery grits. The Cotton Patch Study, Bibles are open, and the men are ready for the dark turn of 1 Samuel chapter 28. Larry, slicing into his country fried steak. Jack, this might be the only thing that gets me through this morning. All right, boys. Last week, David sold a piece of his soul to live comfortably in enemy territory. And chapter 28 opens with the bill coming due. Achish tells David, "You and your men are going to war with me against Israel." David is trapped in his own web. But the camera immediately shifts away from David, and we focus entirely on the absolute tragedy of King Saul. Dan, and it is a dark, dark scene. The Philistines have gathered all their forces at Shunem. Saul gathers Israel at Gilboa. Verse 5 says, "When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart." Herald, now, Saul has been terrified before, but this time is different. In the past, he could at least pretend to have a religious safety net. But look at verse 6. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Jim R. setting his coffee mug down hard, and he's shocked by it. He's like a farmer who completely ignores the oil light on his tractor for 5 years, runs the engine dry, and then gets mad at the mechanic when it finally seizes up in the middle of harvest. Saul spent his entire kingship ignoring God's voice. He blatantly disobeyed Samuel. He slaughtered the priests of the Lord. And now that he's backed into a corner, he expects God to pick up the phone on the first ring. But heaven is completely silent. Pastor Cohn, leaning forward, his voice low and heavy. It is one of the most terrifying judgments in Scripture, Jim. The silence of God. When a man stubbornly hardens his heart against the truth for long enough, eventually, God will just let him have his own way. Saul wanted to run the kingdom without God's interference, and God finally obliged him. Floyd, so what does a desperate man do when heaven goes quiet? He turns to the shadows. Verse 7, Saul says to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." Henry, the absolute hypocrisy of it. Just a few verses earlier, the text reminds us that Saul had expelled all the mediums and spiritists from the land. He made it a capital offense. He knew it was wicked. But fear will make a man dig through his own trash, looking for the very things he claimed to have thrown away. Claude, so his servants tell him there's a witch down in Endor. Saul puts on a disguise, taking off his royal robes, just like he stripped them off at Ramah, and sneaks out in the dead of night with 2 men. He goes to this woman and asks her to bring up a spirit. Jim H. And she's suspicious. She says, "You know what Saul has done. Are you trying to set a trap for my life?" And Saul, acting completely unhinged, swears to her in the name of the Lord that she won't be punished for performing demonic witchcraft. Dan, laughing bitterly, "As surely as the Lord lives, you won't get in trouble for breaking the Lord's law." The man's theology is completely broken, so he tells her to bring up Samuel. Larry, and boys, this is where the chapter gets absolutely wild. Because the woman starts her seance, expecting her usual parlor tricks or a familiar spirit. But look at verse 12. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Harold, she screamed, because she realized this wasn't her doing. God actually permitted the real spirit of Samuel to cross over and deliver one final, devastating message to the king. The witch was just as terrified as Saul was. Robert, Saul asks her what she sees, and she says she sees a spirit coming up. Saul asks what he looks like, and she describes an old man wearing a robe. Saul knows instantly that it's Samuel, and he bows face down on the ground. Henry, and old Samuel doesn't mince words. Even in the afterlife, the prophet is blunt. Verse 15, Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul gives his pathetic excuse, "I am in great distress. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me." Claude, stirring his coffee, And Samuel's response in verse 16 strips away every single delusion Saul has left. Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Pastor Cohn, there is no comfort, no grace, and no second chance. Samuel tells him exactly what the harvest is going to be for the seeds he planted. And then he drops the final, fatal blow in verse 19. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Jim R. Tapping his fork on his plate, the death sentence. The clock has officially run out. And verse 20 says Saul falls completely flat on the ground. His strength is gone. He hasn't eaten all day or all night, and the sheer terror of the truth just physically breaks him. Floyd, and boys, the most ironic part of this entire tragic chapter happens right here at the end. The anointed king of Israel is lying in the dirt, completely broken, and who is the only person to show him any compassion? The witch. Dan, it's incredible. The woman sees how terrified he is, and she actually tries to comfort him. She says, "Look, I risked my life to listen to you. Now please listen to me. Let me give you some food, so you have strength." Jim H. And Saul is so depressed he refuses to eat. He's just lying there waiting to die. But his men and the woman keep pleading with him until he finally gives in. Verse 24 says the woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she quickly butchered. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. She set it before the king and his men. They ate it, and they left that same night. Larry, closing his Bible with a soft thud, and that is the Last Supper of King Saul. Not in the tabernacle, not with the priests of the Lord, but in the dark, smoky house of a witch in Endor, eating a hastily cooked calf before walking out into the night to face his own execution. Pastor Cohn, wiping his mouth with a napkin, a profound sadness in his voice. It is the ultimate picture of a wasted life, boys. A man who started a head taller than everyone else, anointed by the Spirit, given every advantage, ending his days in total darkness because he refused to yield his pride to the Lord. Sin will take you further than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you far more than you ever intended to pay. Jim R., scraping his chair back and reaching for his heavy coat. Well, that is a sobering word to take into the fields today. I don't know about y'all, but I'm going to make sure the lines of communication with the Almighty are wide open this morning. Floyd, tossing his money onto the table. You and me both, Jim. I don't want to end up eating calf in Endor. Thanks for the steak, Jack. It carried the weight today. The table shares a quiet, reverent nod. The men pack up their Bibles, zip up their thick coats against the damp chill, and wave goodbye to Jack. The diner bell jingles as the Cotton Patch Study steps out into the gloomy Piney Grove morning, carrying the heavy, haunting warning of King Saul straight into the work of their day. The early morning fog is still clinging heavily to the loblolly pines outside Jack's diner, but inside, it's bright, loud, and smells like a proper Southern Friday. Jack walks over to the corner booth carrying a massive, steaming platter of crispy fried pork tenderloin medallions, wedged inside split, oversized buttermilk biscuits. He sets it down alongside a large ceramic bowl of hot, spiced apple butter. The Cotton Patch Study is assembled, coffee mugs full, Bibles open to 1 Samuel chapter 29. Larry, slathering a thick spoonful of apple butter onto a pork tenderloin biscuit. Jack, you are a scholar and a gentleman. All right, boys, dig in. Last week we took a dark detour and watched King Saul consult a witch at Endor, securing his own death sentence. But today, the camera swings right back to David. And David is in the biggest mess of his entire life. Dan, taking a bite of a biscuit, he sure is. He is completely trapped in the web he started spinning back in chapter 27. He sold himself to the Philistine king, Achish, as a mercenary. And now, the Philistines are marching to war against Israel at Aphek, and David and his 600 men are marching right along in the rear guard with the king. Harold, it is an impossible dilemma. If David marches into battle and fights against his own people, he slaughters the very nation God anointed him to lead. He'd be a traitor forever. But if he turns on the Philistines in the middle of the fight, Achish's army will wipe his 600 men off the map. He is stuck between a rock and a Philistine spear. Claude, stirring his coffee, he played a foolish game, and he finally got backed into a corner where there is no human way out. But providence shows up in the most unlikely place, boys. Look at verse 3. The commanders of the Philistines see David's troops marching in the back, and they immediately stop the parade. They demand of Achish, "What about these Hebrews?" Jim H. and Achish actually defends him. He tells his generals, "This is David. He's been with me for over a year, and I haven't found a single fault in him since the day he defected to me." Achish is completely blind to the fact that David has been lying to him this entire time. Floyd, laughing, but the generals ain't blind. Verse 4 says the Philistine commanders were absolutely furious. They tell Achish, "Send the man back. He must return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting." They use plain old common sense. They say, "How better could he regain his master's favor than with the heads of our own men?" Henry. And then they bring up the song. The same song that made King Saul so jealous back in the day is the song that the Philistines remember. Verse 5. "Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." David's own reputation as a giant killer is the very thing that disqualifies him from the Philistine army. Pastor Cone, setting his mug down, a warm, knowing smile on his face. And right there, boys, is the profound grace of God in this chapter. God uses the rejection of the enemy to save David from his own foolish compromise. Jim R., leaning his heavy elbows on the table, "Say that again, Pastor." Pastor Cone, God uses rejection to save him. David couldn't get himself out of the trap, so God had the Philistine generals slam the door in his face. How many times in our own lives have we complained bitterly about a closed door? We didn't get the job, the deal fell through, the relationship ended, and we cry out, "Lord, why did you let me get rejected?" We don't realize that God is slamming a door because if we had walked through it, it would have destroyed us. David's rejection was actually his rescue. Dan, that is a heavy, heavy truth. Because David actually acts offended when Achish gives him the bad news. Achish calls David over in verse 6 and says, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, but the commanders don't approve of you. So turn back and go in peace." Harold, and look at David's acting skills in verse 8. He puffs out his chest and says, "But what have I done? What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Floyd, he's laying it on thick. He knows good, and well he's sweating bullets, thanking God under his breath that he doesn't have to fight. But he has to maintain his cover story, so he acts like a hound dog that just got told he can't go hunting. Jim H. and Achish eats it right up. He tells David in verse 9, "I know that you are as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders have said, he must not go up with us into battle." He tells David to pack up his men and leave at the crack of dawn. Claude, pleasing as an angel of God. It's an incredible irony. The pagan king thinks David is a saint, while David is actually a compromised believer who just got pulled out of the fire by the skin of his teeth. Larry, and the chapter ends with verse 11. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. David is officially off the hook. He doesn't have to fight his own people, and he doesn't have to blow his cover. He and his 600 men turn around and start the long, 3-day march back home to Ziklag. Jim R., wiping his mouth with a napkin and taking a slow breath. Well, the Lord sure is merciful. He bailed David out of a terrible situation. They're heading home. Henry, closing his Bible with a dark chuckle. Yeah, they're heading home, all right. But Jim, you remember what's waiting for them when they get back to Ziklag in chapter 30? Jim R., frowning, oh, buddy. That's right. The Lord saved them from the battle, but the fire is already burning at the house. Pastor Cone, sliding out of the booth and grabbing his jacket. Grace gets us out of the trap, boys, but our choices still have consequences. We'll dive into the ashes next week. Dan, tossing a stack of bills near the coffee pot. Well, that's quite the cliffhanger for a Friday. I reckon I'll be thinking about providential rejection all day long while I'm on the tractor. Thanks for the biscuits, Jack. The table shares a warm, hearty laugh. The men gather their Bibles, zip up their thick coats, and step out the glass door. The diner bell jingles as the cotton patch study heads out into the misty Piney Grove morning, carrying the comforting truth of God's rescuing grace into the work of the day. The Friday morning sky over Piney Grove is the color of bruised iron, the air thick and smelling faintly of wood smoke from a distant brush fire. Inside Jack's diner, the heavy diner mugs are already full. Jack walks over to the corner booth carrying a massive, sizzling cast iron skillet. Today it's a hickory-smoked brisket hash, tossed with charred onions and sweet potatoes, topped with a dozen fried eggs, their yolks bright against the dark, smoky meat. He sets down a basket of buttered sourdough, toast to sop it all up. The cotton patch study, Bibles are open, and the men are ready to dive into the ashes of 1 Samuel chapter 30. Larry, breaking a yolk with his fork and letting it run over the brisket. Jack, I think you outdid yourself today. This is exactly what we need for this chapter. All right, boys. Last week, David and his men got sent home early from the Philistine war. They've been marching for 3 straight days to get back to their families in Ziklag. But as they crest the final hill in verse 1, they don't see a welcoming committee. They see smoke. Dan, shaking his head, his voice low, it's every man's absolute worst nightmare. The Amalekites, the very people David had been raiding, came back and hit Ziklag while the men were gone. They burned the town to the ground and took every single woman, child, and infant captive. Verse 4 says David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. These are 600 battle-hardened, scar-covered warriors, and they collapse in the dirt, completely broken. Jim H. And grief turns into anger really fast when you don't know what else to do with it. Look at verse 6. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. These are the same men David protected and provided for. But in their blinding pain, they need somebody to blame, and the boss is the closest target. David has lost his wives, his home, and now his own army is picking up rocks to kill him. Pastor Cone, setting his mug down, his pastoral voice cutting through the diner noise. But boys, this is the exact moment that separates David from Saul. Just 2 chapters ago, when Saul was terrified and out of options, he went to a witch. He sought out darkness. But look at the end of verse 6. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Jim R., tapping his fork on the table. That is the hinge of the entire chapter. When the bottom falls completely out of your life, and even your closest friends turn against you, where do you find your strength? David didn't have a counselor. He didn't have a friendly shoulder to cry on. He had to reach straight up to heaven and pull down the grace of God for himself. Claude, stirring his coffee, and because he found his strength in the Lord, his mind clears. He doesn't panic. He doesn't lash out at his men. Verse 7 says he calls Abiathar the priest and asks for the ephod. He goes through the proper, holy channels. He asks the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" Herald, and the Lord gives him a crystal clear green light. Pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. So the 600 men drop the stones, pick up their swords, and start marching. But they are already exhausted from a 3-day march from Aphek. When they get to the Besor ravine, 200 of the men are so physically spent they literally cannot cross it. Floyd, it breaks your heart for those 200. They want to fight for their families, but their bodies just quit on them. David has to leave a third of his army behind with the supplies and push on with just 400 men. Henry, but this is where the providence of God gets so beautifully specific. David is trying to track an army across a massive desert. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. But out in the middle of nowhere, they find an Egyptian man half dead in a field. Robert, and this is a massive test of David's character. He is in a dead sprint to save his wives. Every second counts. Most commanders would look at a dying stranger in the dirt and say, "We don't have time for this. Keep moving." But they stop. They give him water, food, a piece of a fig cake, and 2 clusters of raisins. They minister to the man, Dan, and it turns out that mercy is the very key to their victory. The man revives, and David asks him who he is. The guy says, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago." Jim H., laughing, "The cruelty of the enemy is what defeats the enemy." The Amalekite master treated his servant like a disposable piece of trash because he got sick. But David treats him with dignity, and in return, the enslaved person says, "Swear you won't hand me back to my master, and I will take you right to their camp." God used David's compassion to provide the GPS coordinates to the enemy camp. Larry, and when they get there, the Amalekites are throwing a massive frat party. Verse 16 says they are scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken. David hits them at dusk and fights them straight through until the evening of the next day, 24 solid hours of combat. And the result in verse 18 is absolute perfection. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. Claude, he brought it all back. Plus, he took all the Amalekites' own flocks and herds as extra plunder. The men are driving this massive herd of livestock back, shouting, "This is David's plunder." He went from facing a mutiny to being a conquering hero in 48 hours. Pastor Cone, but the true test of a king isn't how he handles the battle, boys. It's how he handles the victory. When David gets back to the Besor ravine, the 200 exhausted men come out to meet them. And some of the guys who fought, the text calls them troublemakers and scoundrels, step up and say, "Because they didn't go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." Harold, that is just raw, ugly greed. They are basically saying, "We did the sweating, we do the bleeding, we get the cash. You were too weak, so you get nothing." Jim R., leaning forward, his eyes bright, but David shuts it down instantly. Look at verse 23. No, My brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. David refuses to let them take the credit. He says, "We didn't win this because we are tough. We won this because God is merciful." Floyd, and then David establishes a rule that stands in Israel for generations. Verse 24. The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. Dan, wiping his mouth with his napkin. Man, that is the gospel right there. The guy who held the bags gets the same reward as the guy who swung the sword, because the victory belongs to the king, not the soldiers. It's all grace. Pastor Cohn, it is pure grace, Dan. David takes the broken, the exhausted, and the weak, and he elevates them. He treats them with the same dignity as his strongest warriors. And he doesn't stop there. He takes the extra plunder, and he sends it as gifts to all the elders of Judah, to all the towns where he and his men had roamed. Jim H. He's acting like the king of Israel before he even sits on the throne. He's repairing relationships, blessing his neighbors, and showing the whole country that he is a man of unmatched generosity. Jim R., closing his Bible with a heavy, satisfied thud, and that's exactly the kind of man you want running the county. A man who finds his strength in the Lord, shows mercy to the dying, fights for his family, and shares the spoils with the weak. Harold, standing up and grabbing his heavy coat. I'll say amen to that. What a chapter. The ashes turned into absolute victory. Floyd, tossing a stack of bills onto the table. It's a good word to take to work. Thanks for the brisket hash, Jack. It was exactly what we needed. The table erupts in warm, hearty laughter. The men gather their worn Bibles, zip up their thick coats, and wave goodbye to Jack behind the counter. The diner bell jingles loudly as the Cotton Patch Study steps out into the crisp, smoky Piney Grove morning, carrying the heavy, comforting lesson of David's grace straight into the work of their day. A cold, driving November rain is washing over Piney Grove this Friday morning, turning the fields into thick soup and drumming a heavy, solemn beat on the tin roof of Jack's Diner. Inside, the windows are steamed up, blocking out the gray morning. Jack walks over to the corner booth carrying a massive cast iron skillet he calls the Gilboa. It's a mountain of crispy fried potatoes, scrambled eggs, and thick-cut bacon, completely buried under a heavy blanket of white pepper gravy, with a side platter of hot fried apples to cut the salt. The Cotton Patch Study. Bibles are open to the final chapter of the book, 1 Samuel chapter 31. Larry, serving a heavy scoop of the skillet onto his plate. Jack, you brought out the comfort food today, and we're going to need it. All right, boys, we've reached the end of the road. For 30 chapters, we've watched King Saul slowly unravel. He started a head taller than everyone else, anointed by the Spirit. But he let pride, paranoia, and jealousy eat him alive. And today, the bill finally comes due on Mount Gilboa. Dan, taking a bite of the fried apples, his face serious, and it is a total slaughter. Verse 1 says the Israelites fled before the Philistines, and many fell dead on the mountain. But the part that absolutely breaks my heart is verse 2. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Jonathan dies on the mountain, the man who loved David, the man who willingly gave up the throne, the man who stood up to his own father's madness. He dies right alongside him. Jim H. It just doesn't seem fair, does it? Jonathan was the most righteous man in the royal family. Why didn't God protect him? Why didn't David get there in time to save him? Pastor Cohn, setting his mug down, his pastoral voice low and heavy. It's a hard, bitter truth about living in a fallen world, Jim. We like to think that our sin only affects us. We say, "It's my life. I'm not hurting anybody else." But sin is like a grenade. When it goes off, it doesn't just destroy the man holding it. It destroys anyone standing close to him. Jonathan got caught in the blast radius of his father's rebellion. It's a tragedy, but it reminds us that our spiritual compromises will almost always cost the people we love the most. Claude, stirring his coffee, and Saul has to watch it happen. He watches his sons fall, and then the archers find him. Verse 3 says the fighting grew fierce around Saul. The archers overtook him, and they wounded him critically. He's got shot. He knows he's not going to make it. So he turns to his armor-bearer in verse 4 and says, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." Harold, even with his dying breath, Saul is completely obsessed with his own image. He isn't crying out to God for mercy. He isn't repenting. He is just terrified of being publicly humiliated by the enemy. His pride drove him his entire life, and his pride drove him right to the grave. Floyd, but the armor-bearer is terrified and refuses to do it. You can't really blame the kid. Nobody wants the blood of the Lord's anointed on their hands. So Saul takes matters into his own hands. Verse 4 says, Saul took his own sword and fell on it. And when the armor-bearer sees the king is dead, he falls on his sword too. Henry, it is such a dark, empty way to die. No glory, no peace, just a desperate suicide in the dirt to avoid being tortured. And verse 6 gives us the final obituary. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. The entire administration wiped out by sundown. Jim R., leaning his heavy elbows on the table, and his suicide didn't even prevent the humiliation he was so scared of. The very next day, the Philistines come out to strip the dead, and they find Saul and his boys lying there on Mount Gilboa. Verse 9 says they cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they took his headless body and pinned it to the wall of Bethshan. Robert, shaking his head, they treated the king of Israel like a hunting trophy. They nailed him and his sons to the city wall for the buzzards and the public to mock. It was an absolute, catastrophic defeat for the whole nation. The Israelites in the valley were so terrified they abandoned their towns and ran, and the Philistines just moved right into their houses. Dan, but right when the chapter is at its absolute darkest, right when you think the entire legacy of Saul is going to end in total disgrace, a glimmer of light shines from a place we haven't talked about in a long, long time. Look at verse 11. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, Harold, sitting up straight, his eyes wide, Jabesh Gilead. Boys, you've got to rewind the tape all the way back to chapter 11. 20 or 30 years ago, when Saul was first crowned, the Ammonites threatened to gouge out the right eyes of the men of Jabesh Gilead. And Saul, full of the Spirit of God, marched all night, slaughtered the Ammonites, and saved their town. Floyd, they never forgot it. 40 years of Saul losing his mind, hunting David, and ruining the country. But the men of Jabesh Gilead remembered the man he used to be. They remembered the man who saved them. Jim H. And look at what they do in verse 12. All their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Claude, that is incredible courage. Bethshan was occupied territory. Those men marched into a Philistine stronghold in the dead of night, climbed a wall, and risked their own lives to give a disgraced, headless king a decent burial. Pastor Cone, smiling, a look of deep respect on his face. It is one of the most beautiful acts of honor in the Old Testament. Saul died a failure, but those men refused to let his story end as a spectacle for the enemy. They showed grace to a man who had long forgotten what grace looked like. And don't miss the detail at the end, boys. Where did they bury his bones? Under a tamarisk tree. Back in chapter 22, Saul sat under a tamarisk tree holding his spear, complaining that everyone was against him, right before he slaughtered the priests. Now he is buried under one. Full circle. Jim R., closing his Bible with a heavy, final thud. Well, that is the end of an era. The king who demanded the crown lost it in the dirt. And now the throne is finally empty for the shepherd boy. Dan, scraping the last of the fried apples onto his fork, it makes you stop and think about the legacy you're leaving behind. Are you going to be remembered for the grace you showed, or the spears you threw? Harold, standing up and reaching for his thick rain jacket. I reckon I'd rather be remembered as one of the men who marched through the night to do the right thing, rather than the king who died on his own sword. Floyd, tossing a stack of bills onto the table. Amen to that, Harold. Let's get out in this rain. We survived 1 Samuel, boys. Larry, laughing as he grabs his coat. We did indeed. Next week, we turn the page to 2 Samuel, and the reign of King David finally begins. The table shares a warm, hearty laugh, the heavy solemnity of the chapter giving way to the deep brotherhood of the diner booth. They wave their thanks to Jack, zip up their coats against the driving Alabama rain, and step out the glass door. The diner bell jingles as the cotton patch study heads out into the gray piney grove morning, leaving the tragedy of Saul behind them, ready for the work of a new day.